A real energy catastrophe is brewing in Europe. Gas prices have increased by 115% amid the war in the Middle East. Oil reserves are depleting rapidly, and this could lead to a sharp increase in prices for absolutely everything. And against this backdrop, experts are increasingly saying that Europe may be forced to return to purchasing Russian energy resources. And today, the emboldened dictator Vladimir Putin even offered to resume oil and gas supplies to Europe from Russia. Putin stated that Europe should come to its senses and sign new supply contracts with Moscow. And then in Washington, they also announced that they are ready to completely lift sanctions on Russian oil to balance the market. But the Russians are boasting in vain. First of all, the head of the U.S. Department of Energy, Chris Wright, stated that despite the rumors, the United States of America does not intend to abandon its sanctions policy towards Russia. And secondly, the G7 countries directly stated today that they are ready to tap into their strategic oil reserves to get through this crisis. But they will not buy oil and gas from Putin. But is it really that simple? Let's figure it out together. I'm Alexei Pechi, let's discuss this together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video, where we post breaking news as it comes in. So, as you know, the price of oil in the world has broken through the psychological mark of $100 per barrel, but the situation with gas, as they say, is no better. The price of gas in Europe has shown the sharpest surge since the energy crisis. During the crisis of 2022, the increase compared to the end of February was 115%. Although Europe does not receive a lot of gas from Qatar, which has stopped LNG supplies, it will have to compete with other buyers due to reduced resources. The current crisis is still incomparably smaller in scale than in 2022, when Europe, let me remind you, stopped buying Russian gas. Back then, even before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, gas prices in Europe rose to 80 to 90 euros per megawatt hour. This was partly because Russian Gazprom, for about half a year before the start of the full-scale war, artificially withheld gas from the spot market and kept it in its European storage facilities. So at that time, Putin was trying to blackmail Europe with this gas so that Europe wouldn't sell. In August 2022, the peak gas price exceeded 340 euros per megawatt hour, or, if it's easier for you, that was $3,600 per 1,000 cubic meters. That was the peak of the crisis. So now, of course, there's also a crisis in Europe, but it's much smaller in scale. From Qatar, which stopped liquefied gas supplies due to the war in Iran that blocked the Hormuz Strait, the European Union countries received only 6%. 6% of their LNG imports, while nearly 60% came from the United States of America. But China depends on Qatar for 30%. Overall, the share of the Middle Eastern state of Qatar in the global liquefied gas market is 20%. And the logic here is very simple. It might seem that if Europe doesn't get gas from Qatar, then why should it worry? No, it definitely should worry. If you in Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and so on need an extra tanker of gas from the United States of America, you'll have to offer a high enough price for it so that it doesn't go, for example, to Tokyo. And by the way, several LNG tankers that were heading to Europe already turned to Asia last week because they paid more there. And it's also important to keep in mind that, as the Minister of Energy of Qatar said, even if the conflict in the Middle East ends immediately, it will take Qatar from several weeks to several months to return to a normal supply cycle. And against the backdrop of such news, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin got so agitated that he almost lost the power of speech. Putin stated that Russia is ready to resume oil and gas supplies to Europe in connection with the crisis around Iran. Next is a quote from the bold dictator. If European companies, European buyers suddenly decide to reorient themselves and provide us with long-term, stable cooperation, free from political circumstances, free from political conditions, we are ready to work with Europeans. And he says, by the way, we are waiting. According to Putin, Russia intends to continue supplies to Hungary and Slovakia. These are the last two countries in the European Union that continue to purchase Russian energy resources. The war in Iran and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, through which almost a third of all global oil trade passes, according to dictator Putin, will hit the entire system of international economic relations. Inflation will rise, goods production will suffer, and a new price reality will emerge in the energy markets. Since it is impossible to quickly replace Middle Eastern oil and gas, and now I'll give you another quote from the overexcited Vladimir Putin. Oil production, which depends on the use of the Strait of Hormuz, risks coming to a complete halt in the next month. Well, I'll note right away that it won't stop completely, but it will definitely decrease.
Consumers need oil today. As a result, global oil prices are rising. We can clearly see this. Just in the past week, they've increased by more than 30%. So, I checked today at 5:30 in the morning Moscow time, and it had already hit 119, was over $119 per barrel, then 107, 109, 106. Now, I think, as Igor Ivanovich says, it's fluctuating around 103 at the moment.
Thank you. Then this bold mistake named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin stated that Russian energy companies have always been distinguished by the stability and reliability of their supplies. Let me remind you, these stable and reliable Russian companies cut off gas supplies to Ukraine for political reasons in January 2009 and then cut off gas supplies to Europe in the same year. And, as I said earlier, these very stable, reliable Russian companies. 6 months before the full-scale war in Ukraine, they created an artificial gas shortage in Europe, driving prices sky high, so that Europe would stop supporting Ukraine. But the point is that Vladimir Putin, who has an 8 trillion ruble hole in his budget, is basically begging someone to buy his gas and oil. Of course, he sits there looking smug, trying to say, well, if you need it, come to me yourself. But in reality, he's begging. Because let me remind you, at the start of the full-scale war, Putin was shouting that, yes, that's it, we won't sell gas to Europe. If they want it, let them buy it in rubles. And if they don't want to, then we won't sell it at all. There was all this bravado, all this showing off. Now he's saying, well, if necessary, we're ready to sell. Right. And here, the Americans are also making statements that agitate Vladimir Putin's mind even more. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that Washington could exempt a larger volume of Russian oil from sanctions, after the U.S. issued a 30-day permit the day before, allowing continued sales of Russian oil to India, which is currently still on ships at sea. But it's important to note that the US is not planning to abandon its sanctions policy toward Russia, despite some relaxations due to energy issues amid the war in Europe. This is the statement made by the head of the American Department of Energy, Chris Wright. Here is his quote. "This is simply a pragmatic measure that will be short-term. There will be no changes in policy toward Russia." He also predicted the imminent restoration of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which should improve the situation on the market. But Vladimir Putin's excitement was premature. And here we have to give credit to Europe. They decided not even to look in the direction of this wild, dirty, unwashed Russia. The finance ministers of the G7 countries officially announced today that they are ready, if necessary, to take the necessary measures to support the global supply of energy resources, including releasing reserves, in the context of a sharp rise in oil and gas prices due to the conflict in the Middle East. Let me translate what all this means. It means that the G7 countries are ready to tap into their emergency strategic reserves of oil and gas in order to get through the crisis. And Vladimir Putin can keep telling stories about how stable and reliable his companies are in Russia. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially. You can do this by donating or subscribing using the links and details in the description of this video, or by using the QR code on your screen. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.